Good evening and welcome. Welcome to the inaugural event of the Chinese-Jewish Conversation at Yeshiva University. 大家好，晚上好。今天我们开始中国人和犹太人之间的对话。A special thanks to all of those who've invested many hours to make tonight's event successful. In particular, Sarah Reinitz, Rona Steinerman, and Malka Lebovic. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you. Our special guest speaker this evening is Li Yidan, Debbie Li of Beijing. She's a senior at NYU, majoring in anthropology and art. She's already an experienced and published archaeologist. When I met Miss Li through a mutual friend from Beijing, her passion for archaeology was evident. I shared her honors paper with colleagues in Beijing, and they were duly impressed. And that's when I knew that she'd be a great asset for our school. Miss Li's talk will be framed by our own Dr. Jill Katz, an accomplished biblical archaeologist and a highly respected and actually very popular teacher at Stern College. And we welcome Dr. Katz's students and my own students from the Shira Shirim course. And there's actually overlap between our two classes, but I think that Dr. Katz is the more popular teacher. And Dr. Katz also takes our students on archaeological digs in Israel, which is very exciting. So what's the Chinese-Jewish conversation? Yeshiva is a Jewish university committed to our sacred ancient traditions. Yet since the day of its founding, YU has been outward-facing to engage with the world around us under the rubric of Torah Umada. In the 21st century, the world has become a lot smaller as global networks and connections abound. It's well known that our school has strengthened its ties with Israel, especially under the leadership of President Ari Berman. But YU, as a global center of Jewish studies, is making other connections. A special such connection is with China, the Chinese people, and their ancient traditions. In 2015, we hosted Professor Yuda Fu, the founding director of the Institute for Judaic and Interreligious Studies at Shandong University in Jinan, China. Professor Fu delivered a lecture about the profound parallels between the Jewish and Chinese traditions, and that lecture is available on the Revel YouTube channel. Dr. Fu has trained dozens of graduate students in China in Jewish studies and initiated a project of translating classical Jewish texts into Chinese. Professor Fu himself translated Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, which is no small feat if you're familiar with that work. Over the past 3 years, I've taught an annual course by Professor Fu's invitation at Shandong University, and I've seen firsthand the connections between our traditions. YU also has a growing population of Chinese students, especially at the Katz School. Our Chinese-Jewish conversation creates a welcome space on our increasingly diverse campus. Just last week, we celebrated Chinese New Year in this very room and sang songs from home together. This evening as well, we extend a special welcome to our Chinese students. 非常欢迎亲爱的中国学生们，很高兴你们参加我们的会议。We're grateful to the sponsors of this event, the Provost's Faculty Colloquium, the Katz School, and the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies. Before we begin the program, a word from one of our sponsors, the Revel Graduate School, since many participants here are eligible to take Revel courses. And so it's my pleasure to introduce Malka Lebovic, Revel Director of Outreach and Programming. Now, actually, Malka was part of the Jewish-Chinese conversation from the outset because in 2015, when Professor Fu came, he spent Shabbat at our home in Bergenfield, and Malka came with her family as well. So she's been part of this conversation for a number of years already. And now, Malka, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Malka Lebovic. Thank you so much for coming, especially with the weather out there. Revel is so happy to be part of this tonight. It's our first partnership with the Chinese-Jewish Conversation, which, as you just heard from Dean Cohen, is an incredible initiative that we are so happy to be a part of. Aside from working at Revel, I am also a doctoral student pursuing my PhD in Jewish philosophy. And I see that there are a lot of undergraduate students here today. So I just wanted to take a moment to tell you that undergraduates at Yeshiva University, both at Stern and YC, can actually take graduate level courses at Revel while still in undergrad. Revel has master's and PhD programs in Jewish history, Jewish philosophy, Bible, and Talmud. And this is just a really great opportunity to take interesting courses with an incredible faculty on a wide range of topics. Our classes are high level, they're intellectually stimulating and very in-depth. When I was at Stern, when I was a junior, I actually started taking courses at Revel, and it really completely transformed my undergraduate experience. So if you think that's something that might be interesting to you, you can, our website is on the brochure that's on your seats, and online we have all of our course titles with course descriptions, so you can see if something works out for you. Aside from taking a course or two at Revel, undergraduates can also apply for a BA/MA program, which is great for students who might be interested in continuing on to get their master's after graduation. This is a really fantastic opportunity to jumpstart your degree because you could actually begin to take courses while in undergrad for graduate credit, and it's just a great way to save time and money. There's no additional cost to your undergraduate degree. Aside from our course offerings, we have free community programming throughout the year, like this event. And on this card, you can see some of our upcoming events for the spring semester. And if you want to hear more about what we're doing, you can follow us on Facebook or visit our website. We're always doing interesting things, and we're happy to have everybody be a part of it. I'm here tonight. Rona Steinerman, who's our Director of Admissions, is here in the back, and Sarah Reinitz is our Program Coordinator. We're always happy to speak with anybody who has any questions, and you can visit us on the Wilf campus, first hall, third floor. And I hope you enjoyed tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malka. Our program tonight features two speakers from different worlds. But these worlds actually have much in common. And that's something I discovered immediately on my first visit to China, and I relive it every time I return. Americans often do feel out of their element and a little bit foreign in China. But as a Jewish American, I felt at home in Chinese culture immediately. It's very easy for me to speak with Chinese people, despite the language barrier, and we do understand each other immediately because we share core values. The Chinese and Jewish people are distinctive, if not unique, in taking pride in their continuous and unbroken cultural, literary, and spiritual traditions that go back over 3,000 years. Ezra HaSofer, Ezra the scribe, and Confucius, Kongzi, were roughly contemporaries. Just as the rabbis praise Ezra for his role in canonizing scripture, Confucius is traditionally credited with the crystallization of the Wujing, the five classics, the venerated ancient texts of the Confucian tradition. Much like the Jewish people, the Chinese revere their ancient traditions embodied in the classical texts, and these texts became the subject of commentary and study, just like the Bible and Talmud. The United States is a new country, a youthful culture, always looking forward to the next generation, celebrating innovation and the future. Judaism, however, teaches us to respect our elders and ancestors, to dwell upon the past and even relive it. Just think about the Pesach Seder, commemorating the Exodus from Egypt, or the miracles that we commemorate on Hanukkah and Purim. We also commemorate recent history, good and bad. We celebrate the founding of the State of Israel on Yom Ha'atzmaut and recall the Holocaust on Yom HaShoah. For many of us, there are strong personal dimensions here. Most of the Jewish students in this room have spent a year studying in Israel, and many of you went on tours in Europe that brought you face to face with the horrors of the death camps in Poland and elsewhere. In December, I myself went to visit the Sachsenhausen concentration camp outside of Berlin with my daughter Miri, who's 19 and studying in Israel this year. That's where my grandfather, Dr. Moritz Zalman, was murdered in World War II. A few weeks later, I discovered his grave in Vienna, which I visited for the first time with my son Shai, who's 22. My son, who's a senior in college now, is doing research on my grandfather and discovered that he played a leading role in an anti-fascist party in Vienna. We had long known that he had written Sein Kampf, a book that refutes Hitler's manifesto, Mein Kampf. When Professor Fu was at our home for Shabbat, he was fascinated by this book by my grandfather, Sein Kampf, because it reminded him of the Chinese resistance to Japanese aggression in World War II. So Jewish resistance to Nazi oppression resonated with him. In fact, he asked for my grandfather's book to translate it into Chinese. Now, I had only one copy of the book, so I said to him, Saturday night, Motzei Shabbat, I'll get on Amazon. If I can get another copy, I'll give you this one, and I did. I was able to get it, and he's translating it now. When I go to Jinan, he has it in his office. As Jews, we always remember our grandparents and parents. Just think of how important the Yortzeit is in Jewish tradition. And in traditional Jewish circles, birthdays are much less important than the Yortzeit. In China as well, ancestors are venerated. Debbie Lee's passion for Chinese antiquity, as I've learned, is deeply rooted in her family. When I sent the lecture invitation to Debbie's dad in Beijing, which I composed in Chinese, he explained to me with pride that his father, Debbie's grandfather, was the source of that inspiration. And just over her intercession, she went back to Beijing and saw her grandfather. As a Jewish parent, I know exactly how her dad feels. I wrote back to him that I get the same gratification when my son studies about my grandfather's political and intellectual resistance to the Nazis. Unfortunately, my grandfather believed that the Nazis could be defeated with scholarship and ideals, and he paid the ultimate price for that. But as Jews, we always remember that spiritual resistance ultimately prevails. America is founded on individualism, liberty, pursuit of happiness, self-fulfillment. By contrast, in Judaism and Chinese tradition, the ideal is to be part of a community, a family, to care for others. Those values are deeply rooted in the classical Jewish texts, the Torah and Talmud. Next month, on March 13th, we will be privileged to hear a lecture on these values in the Confucian tradition. And there's a flyer in the back about that, and it's also mentioned in your brochure here. The lecture will be given by Professor Roger Ames, a leading world scholar of Chinese thought. By way of introducing our speakers this evening, I'd like to focus on another commonality between our traditions, the pride we take in our ancient history and the role it plays in our respective cultures. When we study our ancient texts, we take a literary path to connect with our heritage. In China, as you will hear from Miss Li, the ancient historian of the Han Dynasty, Sima Qian, who lived in the 2nd century BCE, codified a history of ancient China. He drew upon earlier sources, such as the Spring and Autumn Annals attributed to Confucius. Interest in ancient China emerged strongly in the Song Dynasty in the 11th century. As Ms. Li will discuss, Chinese history in China was not a disinterested or neutral discipline. It was always culturally charged. As Jews, we also study our history in a cultural framework. The biblical narrative teaches of the origins of the Jewish people and its history, its prophets, kings, and sages. Archaeology is exciting because it connects us materially with the past in ways that go beyond the literary traditions. It's one thing to learn history from the Bible, as Jews have done for centuries, but there's a special thrill of standing in the very spot where Joshua entered the land of Israel or where David encountered Goliath. But at the same time, archaeology presents challenges to the traditional narratives. As proponents of Torah Umada, we recognize the importance of science as well as our tradition. At YU, we adopt a complex approach. We follow the example of Maimonides and apply interpretation, both to the classical texts and the scientific results of archaeology, which themselves are subject to interpretation. Our two speakers this evening will offer us a valuable window into the exciting world of biblical and ancient Chinese archaeology. And now we are privileged to hear from Dr. Jill Katz, who will offer an overview of what we can learn from the archaeological records about state development in ancient China and Israel.
And just make sure I'll keep my eye on my watch here. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. It's wonderful to see everybody here, to see the students, to see the community members. I owe a big debt of gratitude, of course, to Dr. Cohn here. He's really the brainchild behind this. I'm just kind of along for the ride, pretty much like you are. And also, I'll tell you what a delight it is to have a young scholar with us as well. You know, this is what universities are all about. This is what universities do. Sometimes, you know, we might forget, but it's as exciting as it is for her. I just want you to know it's as exciting for me as well. And you're an inspiration for the young undergraduates who are here. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly kind of introduce the topic of the rise of the state, and then I'll speak about Israel more and just kind of segue, because I'm going to let our other speaker really pretty much talk about China. Let me just make sure I can figure this out. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So what you see in this, should we turn off the lights, you think, or can people see okay? No, we're not going to turn off the lights. They need the lights on. Okay. Hopefully you'll be able to see what's going on here. Okay, so what we have here is that when we talk about the rise of the state, what we're really talking about is the emergence of civilization. And believe it or not, it has happened on more than one occasion independently. So on the other hand, it's a pretty rare event for it to happen. There are 6 places in the world where we have the independent rise of the state. And you can see them on the map. 4 are in the old world and 2 are in the new world. Sometimes there's a little bit of debate about how much, was there any influence between the places. But for the most part, archaeologists pretty much agree that we have these 6 independent loci of the state. So one of the things, of course, you'll notice is that while China is one of the 6, Israel is actually not. So we'll get to that. Now, these 6 places in some ways seem to overlap with another very important event, which was the origins of agriculture, right? When people first began to cultivate and to intensively farm and grow their own foods. And in some ways these overlap, but not entirely. And that's a conversation for another time. But it is true, because you would need a very large agricultural surplus before you can even entertain the prospect of having a state. So they are in some ways related. Now, you don't need to read all of this, but I wanted to make the point that studying the rise of the state is something that archaeologists are basically obsessed with. In an introduction to archaeology class, like some of the students are in, we basically cover 2 main themes. One is the rise of agriculture, and the other is the rise of the state. And yes, we can easily spend 6, 7, 8 weeks on this particular issue, especially when you go through each example. So we are obsessed with the rise of the state. And when you're talking about the primary development of the state, well, of course, that happened in the past, right? So the only way that you can really study it is through archaeology. Of course, that's one of the advantages of archaeology over history, but again, save that for another conversation. The other thing, though, is that archaeologists at this point have a pretty good understanding of not only the rise of the state, but how to identify it in the archaeological record. And so the list that you see here is very specific to things that can be identified in the archaeological record. And they've been divided now into primary and secondary. I would say the keys to all of this, number one, is when you're dealing with a state-level society, you're dealing with the emergence of cities. Okay, so for the first time, you're going to have people not just living in small villages, but now living in large urban areas. And as a result, the whole dynamic, the interpersonal relationships change, because now for the first time, people will identify more with their city and with that community than necessarily with their family or with their clan. So it kind of upends social relationships. The other thing is that you have the rise then of specialization. So not everybody is a farmer anymore. Not everybody is engaged in food. And you have the rise of an administrative class. And in fact, these administrators themselves are in some ways not just the result of state-level society, but they themselves are the architects of state-level society, because they're the ones who sort of coordinate all of the new sort of bureaucratic tasks that emerge with the rise of the state, many of which revolve around taxation. So as soon as you have a state, you have taxes, and you must pay your taxes. It's not just a suggestion anymore. It's it's imperative. The other very, very key part to all of this is you must have, in order to support these administrators and this new class of specialists, whether they're craftspeople or involved in religious practice, you must have a very significant agricultural surplus. All right, so the farmers who historically would kind of grow enough for themselves, and maybe a slight addition as a hedge against uncertainty, now are going to be growing as much as 5 times what they would personally consume. And in order to do that, it doesn't mean that they just worked 5 times harder, but usually there's some kind of technological innovations that go along at the same time, whether it's new plows, whether it's using animal traction for the first time using oxen. So there's a major, major increase in the surplus, which is then coordinated, which is gathered and coordinated by the administrators, and that all that food is used to support the people who are running the state. Okay, so we have a pretty good idea of what happens with a state, how it emerges. Each case is different. So all of these 6 primary examples are going to go through their own trajectory a little bit, but the basic rules are more or less the same. The other thing to keep in mind is that it is not inevitable that states will arise. It is not simply that you go from, say, bands to tribes to chiefdoms to states, but there is something qualitatively different about a state. It's not just a bigger chiefdom or a bigger tribal society. And I think you'll see that in the case of China as well. Okay. So you've had the chance to look at the 6 loci for primary state development. So one of the things you notice here, I've put up the map of the Middle East here, and you see that the land of Israel, which is written as Canaan, or Canaan here, was not the locus of primary innovation for the state. So the Canaanite state, which does begin about 5,000 years ago, so maybe about 500 years after Mesopotamia, 200 to 300 years after the state evolves in Egypt, it is considered a secondary state. So in many ways, it was inspired by events that happened in Egypt and in Mesopotamia. Now, also you can notice here the land of Israel is a rather small piece of land. Also geographically, it's got a lot of topography. You've got the coast, you've got the foothills, you have the hills, you then have the valleys. And as a result of being kind of chopped up, it was not a place that was really unified. And so as the state emerges, as the Canaanite state emerges 5,000 years ago, it is mostly of petty kingdoms, little city-states, as opposed to a unified state that you would say, like have an ancient Rome or an ancient Egypt. And we find, so beginning 5,000 years ago, in the land of Israel, there is excellent evidence for state-level society. We have cities. that are surrounded and fortified by walls. Each city has a palace. There are temples. There are large storage facilities. There is a cultural tradition of an artistic tradition that develops. All of these things. Mathematics develops. Ultimately, it takes a little while longer. They're using other writing systems, but ultimately a new writing system will emerge. So all of these characteristics of states do emerge in the land of Israel beginning about 5,000 years ago. And we're going to get to Israel, don't worry, but to the state of Israel. But just as far as the Canaanite state, so again, 5,000 years ago, the basis of the state, it was based on a very, very strong agricultural system. They were growing wheat and barley and legumes, and they had, of course, plows and animals. And they, so you had the oxen pulling the plows, you had sheep and goats, kind of things that you're familiar with if you've been to Israel recently. It's the same kind of flora and fauna. The other aspect, though, is that there were two main products that were grown in the land of Israel that were very productive and that were desired for export, and particularly to Egypt. And that is, we have here, first, you can see the olives and olive oil. It's a little bit of a disappointment when I have to tell the students they were not eating the Mediterranean diet this wasn't for salad. The oil was basically used for light, right? So this was the preferred fuel for the burning of light, for lamps, for menorahs, right? So that was a big export, a lot of demand from Egypt for that. And the second thing that was a big product for the land of Israel, and today is still, is a major product, of course, is wine. And both of these products require a certain temperature in order to fully ripen, which they did not achieve very well in Egypt. But was obviously achieved quite well in the land of Israel. Both of these plants are indigenous to the land of Israel and to sort of this area, and so they did quite well, and this was an important part of the economy. Now, looking at the slide, we're going to jump ahead, because now specifically when we talk about Israel, the point is that by the time we have ancient Israel, which the Israelite state under King David emerges at 1000 BCE, so 3,000 years ago. Keep in mind, there had been a Canaanite state already for 2,000 years. Okay, so it's not a primary state. There's been state all around. On the other hand, the process of becoming a state is a very instructive and interesting one for us. So here you can see the green is where that's the heartland of the state of Israel, and then the orange and the red are referring to the Philistines. So the state of Israel emerges in the hill country. Okay, so again, you go in the land of Israel, you have a coast and some foothills, and then you have some hills as you move towards the east. So the state of Israel emerges kind of in the east, and it is not. There's a couple factors to keep in mind. One is that the state emerges at a time where there's no outside interference. So this is a time in history when there's really no dominant empire. All of those empires that we say from the late Bronze Age, and I know you probably were just thinking about that, like what happened to the Mycenaeans? What happened to the Hittites? What happened to the new kingdom in Egypt, right? So they've all collapsed. As a result, you sort of have this power vacuum. And that gives these little tiny nation states an opportunity to flourish and to grow. And they're not independent, right? So I think this is something to keep in mind, I think, when you hear the story about China now, is that you have these different polities that are competing with each other and that are speaking to each other and seeing what's going on. And there's, for sure, if you want to understand the rise of the state of Israel, you must keep in mind the Philistines. It was not independent of that. The Philistines, on the contrary, were a tremendous catalyst for the rise of the state of Israel. Prior to the state, right, if you know your biblical history, it's known as the period of the judges, or the Shoftim. Okay, so this is a period of really village life, rural, just agricultural farmsteads. There's no cities. There's in the land of among the Israelites. There's no cities. There's no temple. Obviously, there's no palace. There's no capital. Jerusalem is not even under Jewish control, right, or Israelite control. It's under Canaanite control. So you're dealing with just a simple agrarian society. And when trouble emerges, a charismatic leader kind of rises up, helps take care of the problem, and then as soon as the problem is solved, goes back to a regular life. So you don't even have a tradition of passing down leadership from father to son. Okay, so that's the period of the judges. On the other hand, the Philistines are actually a state. They're a small state, but they are immigrants from the Greek world who have come to the coast, filled an area that used to be under Egyptian control, but again, the Egyptians had abandoned it. And meanwhile, they have a state, right? If you remember from the Bible, they have 5 main cities. It's a pentapolis. They have kings. They have standing armies. They have cities, fortified cities. They have temples. They have palaces. They've got it all. On the other hand, as the Philistines are looking up at the hills, they see some really, really nice agricultural land. And one way to increase taxation, right? I think we were just talking about in a class today. One way to increase taxation, you have 3 ways. One is tax people more, right? You're probably familiar with that. 2 is conquer more people so you have more people to tax, right? That works also. And 3, of course, what's the 3rd way? Make your people more productive so that they're generating more income. So the Philistines were looking at option 2, which was we want to increase our taxes. And hey, we see this incredibly fertile land up there. They got farmers. They're growing a lot of grapes and a lot of great, wine, a lot of good olive oil. And so they start to eye it and start to expand. And Israel is confronted with a situation where you had pretty much a very nice, almost egalitarian society where everybody's simple farmers, and there is a certain hesitancy about becoming a state, right? We hear in the Bible it talks about how the warning that be careful about, because they say we want a king, we need a king, we need to be organized in order to confront the Philistines, otherwise they're going to attack us and destroy us. And there's a warning. Listen, you get a king, he's going to enslave you. He's going to tax you. It's not going to be this really comfortable life. So they are aware of what will happen, right? It's because they're not a primary state. They know what a state is. They've been to Egypt. They see the Canaanites. They see the Philistines. They know what the trade-offs are. And yet, in order to preserve their way of life and not be engulfed by the Philistines, they ended up having to become a state and choosing a leader, and ultimately they needed somebody they needed a standing army. They needed a king. They needed that organizational structure in order to repel the Philistines. So that was a very direct catalyst to the rise of the state. So what does the state look like? So the state at the beginning, in the land of Israel, and this is something to keep in mind when you compare with the Chinese example, it is tiny, okay? It is very, very small, but nevertheless, it is a true state. The state is called something, archaeologists have, there's different kinds of states, right? There's different kinds of cities. Like a city like Washington, D.C. is very different than a city like New York, right? So Jerusalem, this is a picture of Jerusalem, this is a state that's really what they call a regal ritual city. It's really a place, ultimately, you don't see it here yet because this is David's city, so there's no temple, but it's a place for the king to live and his family, for his dynasty, and it is also a place for the temple, for the main spiritual center. It is basically a spiritual political center, and that's about it. And that's who lives in the city, are people who are connected to that. It does not have a huge administration. In fact, if you read in the Bible what Solomon's administration looked like, you'll see it's just a handful of people. It's not, it doesn't look forget about it. I mean, we have more administrators on the 6th floor probably than Solomon had in his entire state. But anyway, but it is a city. You see that it's walled. It has a king, and interestingly, one of my favorite pictures this is an artist's construction of David's palace. Again, this is it's a reconstruction. It's not all we have maybe are the foundation stones, but. That again, I'll explain that later. But in the meantime, one of my favorite things here is if you look closely, you see the little tent there. That's the tent where the Aron was brought and kept there because it is, again, to say it's a religious, spiritual city. It has both of those aspects to it. And that is important in understanding what Jerusalem was, what kind of a city it is, and what kind of a state ultimately Israel, ultimately Judah will become, okay? Oops. Then, David only has the little tent. So in the next generation under Solomon, we have the building of the temple. And that really solidifies that it's a spiritual center. It's the main base for the religious life. So this is just a picture then of Solomon's city. Again, how big is it? Probably not more than 40 acres. Okay, it's a small city. Maybe somewhere between 2,000 to 5,000 people lived there. The people who lived there were people, again, associated with the running of the government, the dynastic family, and the people associated with running of the temple. That's who lived there. Everybody else lived in their villages, and they were farmers, and there weren't that many, and then that very small cohort of administrators. These are some definitions of these regal ritual cities. What we know about these regal ritual cities, again, is that the people who live in Jerusalem, they don't live that much differently than the people who live in the villages. Maybe, and even the king. The king is just sort of a bigger, richer, little bit more significant version of what a typical villager looks like. It's a difference in like a little bit, but it's not a qualitative difference. Maybe a difference in quantity, a little bit richer, but not a difference in quality. His life looks pretty similar to what a villager's life looks like. It's a pretty weak state, a regal ritual city, and one that's very dependent on the countryside, right? The city itself doesn't have a lot of way to generate income. So that's something also to keep in mind when we talk, because other cities are going to be more administrative. There's other cities that are more commercial, ones that have ways to actually generate income. Jerusalem didn't have a lot of ways to generate income except through the collecting of taxes, basically. Reminds us of some cities we know. Okay, so it is a weak state. And one of the things, of course, that we know that happens right after Solomon is that the state divides. And so Jerusalem now becomes the capital of a state that's only half the size of what it was before, and not even the wealthy half. It's like the poor half. So here you see in the purple, you can see just how tiny Judah is. So for those of you who have spent time in Israel, you can see, you're basically, if here it's a little bit north of Jerusalem, and going down here, a little bit down into the Negev, and that's about it. So it's a tiny state. Again, one of the big changes we're going to see, one of the things when you compare Israel to China is going to be the scale. But the other thing is, it wasn't just the Philistines that were the catalyst. This is showing you right after the kingdom has divided. And what you see then is lots and lots of these little tiny city-states that are all emerging at the same time. So just as Israel and Judah are becoming states, you have Moab. Moab is becoming a state. Edom is becoming a state. Aram is becoming a state. You have Phoenicia to the north, and you still have the Philistines. So in this little tiny land, look how many nations there are. Look how many little tiny nation states are all emerging at the same time, and everything is in relationship to each other. And now we'll switch over a little bit to China. So again, think that to me, Debbie is going to go into the details. Obviously, the scale is going to be very, very, very different. The population that you're talking about, the size of territory. But this is a way also for me to pay homage to a former teacher of mine. His picture is here. This is, I don't know if you recognize him. Okay, so this is Casey Cheng, or Kwang Chi Chang. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but he was my professor, and a really, really delightful person. And he was probably the person who at the time, when I was an undergrad in the late 80s, really was kind of first and foremost the ones who brought Chinese history and Chinese archaeology to the West. Again, it was at a time when there wasn't a lot of cultural, connections between the two countries, and not a lot of, we didn't really know what was going on in China, and he was sort of the mediator, the one who taught us about China and published some books. One of the things that always stuck with me, though, is he mentioned he was very intrigued by the active role that religion played in state development. And so one of the things that, of course, in China, they find these enormous bronze vessels. And so I don't want to take your thunder. And I don't know if I think you are going to talk about them, so I won't say anything. But these bronze vessels for him were the key to the state, and he saw it very much as that ideology played a critical role in the development of the state. And so at this point, I think I'm going to stop talking and let Debbie continue going. She looks very worried. Okay, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming today, despite the weather, and thank you, Professor Katz, for that very nice introduction, because everything she said about state development is very pertinent to what we're talking about today, although our area of interest is slightly before that in China. So my name is Debbie, as you might have heard, and I study anthropology and art history at NYU currently. And my passion for archaeology has long directed this path of study, as well as me being a participatory member of the Chinese culture, history, and society. So my interests naturally lay in my home culture. And piggybacking on the festivities of the Chinese New Year, which was last week, and the Chinese and Jewish exchange program that we have here at YU, I'll be sharing with you today what I am most passionate about in this field. So today our focus is primarily on prehistoric and early dynastic archaeology, so just before and at the beginning of state development in China. This period is both interesting and very perplexing, as it begins to overlap with historiography practices as well as archaeology. As we will see, the inherent complexities of historiography is a major issue that is negotiated with in archaeological research for both Chinese and biblical and other regional archaeological studies. But the aim of this presentation is not to have you all leave as competent and all-knowing archaeologists of Chinese prehistoric archaeology, but it's just to share with you the fun and excitement of this field that is often overlooked, as well as the relevant controversies and debates that we have going on in ancient Chinese archaeology. So I'll only be sharing with you some of the archetypal and textbook examples that we have of ancient Chinese prehistory, as well as the information that I have at the site at which I worked last summer. So as such, this presentation is by no means comprehensive, but only representative, so I hope you get a general picture of what Chinese prehistoric archaeology would look like. So before we begin looking into the specific sites, it's important to acknowledge the political and cultural context that China is in and its archaeology began with, because this will make big differences to how archaeology is done here. According to the official modern Chinese narrative, The Chinese culture is promoted as pure and heavily historically rooted, with a special emphasis on the quote-unquote 5,000-year-old occupation on this land by the 中华民族, also known as the Chinese ethnicities, which is stressed as a legitimate validation to continuously govern this geographical territory. So the idea that the same traceable and uninterrupted lineage of peoples that had thrived on the same geographical terrain thousands of years ago still occupies it today serves as a foundation for the spirited nationalism that is exhorted by the Chinese official teachings. Archaeological research has provided invaluable evidence to support this continuity, or the idea of the continuity of human existence and increasing complexity throughout the millenniums on this piece of land. However, it has also revealed that ancient pasts are not as homogeneous as the official narrative ostensibly conveys. In this case, archaeology is both a complementary as well as a counteracting tool to complicate recorded history, and its contribution to weaving Chinese cultural and national ideologies is immeasurable. So this is a general overarching timeline of the Chinese prehistoric periods. As some of you might know, China's history, official history, begins with the first three dynasties here, the Xia, Shang, and Zhou, beginning in the 2nd millennium BCE. But for the sake of this presentation, there was human occupation in China long before that, starting in the Paleolithic, but for the purposes of our talk, we'll only be focusing on the ones highlighted in red. That being said, I have the timeline of future dynasties down here as well, as these later dynasties produced many historians and scholars such as Confucius and Sima Qian that we talked about before, who were nevertheless integral to the formation of modern Chinese archaeology millenniums later today. So geographical context. The beginnings of Chinese civilization, as it is known today, flourished from this region known as the Central Plains. Let's see. Wait. Oh, here, roughly corresponding to the Neolithic area marked on this map. Unsurprisingly, this region is now regarded with high historical, cultural, and archaeological importance, as it's known as the cradle of Chinese civilization, so where everything stemmed from. This area today consists of modern-day Beijing and Xi'an, which you can see here. This is Xi'an, and this is Beijing, very close by. And these are two major cultural and economic centers that have never really ceased to prosper throughout the centuries. In particular, the region around Xi'an is one of the longest occupied capitals throughout the dynasties and is incredibly salient as a locus of human settlement since the Neolithic times, and this is where my own excavation site was located. So before delving straight into the sites, there's a little more history to be said. It's necessary to understand that Chinese modern archaeology has not begun for a really, really long time comparing to its Western counterpart. However, historiography practices have always been a part of Chinese culture since 3,000 years ago, from the beginnings of recorded script on oracle bones in the Shang dynasty, which you see here. So oracle bones are the earliest surviving forms of Chinese writing in this region, and they serve as the primary evolution of the modern Chinese logographic script that we see today. So they evolved from this form of writing. They were made by burning a hot implement on tortoise shell or ox bone, and the cracks that appear, which are these, are then interpreted by a special court interpreter. The results are either going to be auspicious or sinister, as usually an imperial official would ask a yes or no question, so it's only one or the other. And the results are then recorded on the back in the form of writing. 1,000 years later, in the early Han Dynasty, as Professor Cohen have already said, a very important historian by the name of Sima Qian wrote the first surviving history of ancient China, known as the Shiji. After this period, the Song dynasty saw an increasing interest in antiquarianism and organizing a cultural past that was more or less prompted by previous Confucian teachings. But since then, only in the early 20th century, which we know of very familiarly, did the same intensity in systematizing antiquity reappear. One manifestation being the emphasis on archaeological research that was initiated by Western scholars. The 1920s was a period of great political turmoil and instability, during which foreign archaeologists such as J.G. Anderson were invited to be a part of and more like lead archaeological excavations. This exposure to more archaeological methodology prompted Chinese scholars to re-examine and question the previous antiquarianism that had made up the dominant Chinese culture as they knew it up until then. So with the discovery of Yinxu, which was the last capital of the Shang dynasty, and the Shang dynasty is so far internationally recognized as the first official Chinese dynasty. So with the discovery of this last capital, the significance in historical and archaeological overlaps is brought to the forefront, as it confirms the records in Shiji about this ancient past, as well as revealing the material remains as a testament to this early culture's prosperity. Later in the 20th century, the discovery of Yinxu prompted the initiation of the Xiashangzhou chronology project, initiated by Professor Li Xueqin, which aimed to construct an absolute date of the beginning and ends of China's first three dynasties. And now you already see how important it is for the Chinese official teachings to have such dates in mind. At approximately the same time, Professor Su Bingqi's regional systems and cultural types model for Chinese Neolithic development became a revolutionary approach that debunked the previous idea of a so-called center, which is the Central Plains being the overarching center of settlement. So, in other words, he promoted a constellated pattern or way of seeing Neolithic site development rather than focusing on one center that had these other smaller allied peripheral regions. So now modern archaeology examines all the trajectories of interaction that would have shaped the Neolithic development period. So this presentation will not be organized in ranks or preferences or personal preferences, but rather in strict chronological order. But it so happens that the earliest find in Chinese archaeology is also one of the most culturally significant. Here we have the Homo erectus pekinensis, an early hominin species that is also known as Peking man, that was found at Zhoukou, a cave site that is really close to modern-day Beijing right now. Peking man is not just one man, it's a species. And it is known as Peking man because previously Beijing was known as Peking. So, this discovery was made with the help and initiation of J.G. Anderson and Walter Granger, which were both foreign archaeologists that came in at a time of political instability. And it just so happens that the Zhoukou bones and skulls disappeared before World War II, before reappearing again in the United States, mysteriously. When this UNESCO heritage site is contextualized within Chinese and human history, its evidence proves to be invaluable for spurring on the debate about human occupation history in Asia, as well as the world. So one theory that some of you may have heard of is the so-called out of Africa theory, which argues that Homo sapiens evolved collectively in East Africa before migrating into Eurasia and replacing the existing hominin populations there, such as the Homo erectus that you see here. On the other hand, the multi-regional hypothesis describes modern human evolution as independently occurring in various global regions with gene flow between populations that resulted in the development of modern Homo sapiens, if I'm correct, Professor Katz. However, as some of us might know, genetic differences between global human populations, regardless of anatomical variations, is very, very minimal. So it's not very likely that we all independently developed in global regions and then achieved such a genetic similarity. So what might have occurred was likely some combination of these processes, but probably leaning towards more of a collective evolution and migration. However, what is important here is that the multi-regional hypothesis is still supported in China right now because it supports the idea that Homo sapiens could have independently and locally evolved in China, as there was the existence, now proven with the skull, of an earlier hominin species that existed there. So the Peking man was a very politically and culturally charged discovery, even now, even today. As Barry Saltman says very nicely in his paper, the notion of a continuous and uninterrupted heritage on a genetic level, so a biological and so-called objective level, scientific and everything, is very salient for validating the racial nationalism that is so exhorted by the official narrative even today. And we see this, the modern influences of Peking man, very pertinently in Chinese culture with this image of the 2008 Beijing Olympics, where the torch for the relay, as the Olympic tradition goes, was lit at Zhoukou-dian. And it was set up to be a metaphorical tribute to the earliest human ancestors of China, who were also believed to have been the first people to use fire in a controlled manner in Asian, if not human, history. However, this evidence is now being questioned, so that we would need to reconsider this. But this example shows how important archaeology is for us today, as it is able to bring a past that we think of as long gone back into the modern times. And as we can see here with this famous Chinese actor's happy face, it is a very proud achievement for archaeology to have do this. But whether the results that it has set out, it has produced are correct is another question. So this is the site where I worked and a place that I have very closely to my heart right now. It's called Yangguanzhai, it's on the peripheries of Xi'an, which was the capital that we were talking about, that was very important for Chinese dynastic history. It's located in central Shanxi at the intersection of two major rivers, the Jing and Wei rivers, so it's a prime location for settlement and later state development. It's the largest mid to late Neolithic site in the Guanzhong and Central Plains area, and it belonged to the Yangshao culture, which was a major Neolithic culture in this Guanzhong area. It was mostly during the sub-phases, the Miaodigo and Banpo phases that you can see here of the Yangshao culture. And during this late period of Yangshao, it was an era of great social and technological development with numerous super sites and indicators of social complexities, of which this is one site, but it's known as a super site. It's not that big according to modern standards, but it is still the size of a substantive village that we have today. So what makes this site so special and worth studying and keeping me interested in? A few significant discoveries include a very, very large moat around the living area of really unprecedented scale, but we're not entirely sure if this was a form of advanced defense or civil control. And with more research, we'd have to look into that, but more likely both. And this moat would signify the investment of huge human production processes that would have sought organization in order to create such a feature. And what I personally think is the most interesting and coolest feature of this site is the mass cemetery towards the east, which was very interesting and notably separate from the living areas. So all of the graves of the only adults who resided here, all of the graves are very closely packed together, and they're all towards one side of the living area. The water pond is probably arguably the most important feature of this site here, because it's the only Neolithic site in this region with such a large-scale water source. And more importantly, it had a drainage system, which was really a technological feat. And the water pond was where we worked, so that was very interesting. I almost fell into the drain, so. And lastly, we have these 庙底沟 vessels that were decorated with these what we call abstract fish patterns that were incongruent to the 庙底沟 cultural tradition. So we know that this site was very much culturally integrated with different sites of this area. And you can see actually on the road to the site a lot of these pottery sherds that just like kind of stick out, but there's so many that no one really wants to pick them up anymore because you'd have to wash them and bag them and things like that. So these are through my own pictures from this excavation. You can't really see with this light, but this is an urn burial. Urn burials were part of the late Neolithic tradition, where children who died prematurely had their bodies put together in two urns, kind of clasped together like this with the openings. But what made this feature very special is that you see this is one urn here with the opening towards the north side, yet this is another smaller urn with its opening towards the end of this urn. So without any disturbances that we have found in this area, it's hard to know why this arrangement was in such a way. And we found part of a child's cranium and a few long bones. You can see it more closely here. That is a little long bone that was already very calcified, so when you touch it, it would just shatter, or it would become powder. But with these strange arrangements that you would usually not see in an urn burial, we had a lot of arguments about whether or why this was the case, because this was indeed buried next to a house where presumably the child's family or caretaker would have lived, and they would just bury it in that house. But even when we left the site, we still don't have an adequate explanation, but many, many interpretations for why this was the case. And up here, I have this picture because this cut here, it's hard to see under this lighting, but this is a very fine cut that would indicate that it's a modern intervention, a modern disturbance to this feature that was very recent. And this was probably from previous seasons' excavations when they accidentally perhaps cut into this vessel. So maybe a part of this vessel that we have missing today would be bagged in some other excavations bags that we'd have to sort through again. That's why labeling in archaeology is so important. And this is an interesting feature here. This was the product of dung beetles and what we call bioturbation. So it's environmental disturbances to a feature. And in here, we dug it up, but there used to be like this ball that you can imagine was the product of dung beetles. So we don't know what was inside, but it was rock hard. And that would show us that disturbances to the site would have occurred without any human intervention at all as well. So this arrangement of this vessel here may have been the cause of such bioturbations. This diagram here, you can't really see very clearly, but this is what we do in archaeology, which is to read the stratigraphy, so the soil color texture differences on the many bifurcations and the cuts that we make on the site walls. So we have here layer 1, which is a very thin, light-colored layer right below the surface. And this is layer 2, a very dark and very hard sediment that would have been the result of human intervention, but we're not entirely sure what it is. And here is layer 3, a fine, silty, lighter colored layer that we found at this point. But for both these features, when we left the site, we didn't have any very probable conclusions as to why they appeared in such strange manners. But so we can see that there's still many unanswered questions here. But I'd like to work here more in the future, as it is a very important site. Okay. But not more important than this site, which is the Arlito. Now we enter into one of the most heated discussions of Chinese dynastic beginnings. Since the Shang, China's historical genealogy has been recorded by one dynasty after the other, and these records are crucial in confirming the notion of a continuous history and therefore culture on this piece of land. According to ancient historical texts, the first dynasty, which was the Xia, did exist, and Chinese scholarship supports this, although the dynasty's existence still needs international confirmation. But if this is confirmed, then it would push back the beginnings of Chinese dynastic civilization for around 1,000 or so more years. So this site, Arlito, is the most important piece of evidence that would reaffirm the existence and actuality of the Xia dynasty. It's believed to be the capital of this first dynasty for its large size and clear evidence of social stratification. And as Professor Katz already said, this is the beginnings of state development where social complexity begins to appear. So what we have here are two palatial structures in the middle of this settlement area that was also connected with designated areas for craft production of bronze and jade and other precious objects in close proximity to the palace area. So they were probably considered prestigious goods that was controlled by the elite. Other evidence of social stratification include rammed earth foundations for housing, a city wall, and signs of paved roads that would have all required heavy human labor contribution and organization in order to achieve. So we have already clear evidence of social hierarchy and organization, as well as the probable existence of administration or rulers at this so-called capital of the Xia, which was Arlito. However, rather problematically, the idea of there being a Xia dynasty did come from historical records, which is not always very neutral in the things that they tried to describe. And especially because the existence of the Xia was written in the Shang dynasty, which was the dynasty that conquered its records. So in that case, you can imagine how certain biases would have existed. So following this historical information, archaeologists deduced that this site, being the largest and most complex one in the described area, would be the capital. But apart from this deduction and the unearthing of a limited number of prototypical bronze vessels that you see here, there's no definitive evidence that directly links Arlito to this first Xia dynasty. So it might be just a simple complex, that's an oxymoron, but simply a complex polity in this area that existed contemporaneously. So we see that concrete conclusions have yet to be reached for the identity of this site, but also that biases of history and the political stance behind archaeological research, along with the ancient political pretenses that govern historical records, must be recognized before we delve straight into concrete conclusions. So this is a topic that still requires further research into. Now, this is my, I wouldn't say main, but one of the main areas of that I'm interested in, called Sanxingdui. Sanxingdui is a site in Chengdu, in Sichuan province. Sorry, the map here is really small, but you see that Sichuan is further southwest of the area we were just at, which was in somewhat northern East China in the Central Plains area. So it is quite a distance, especially for the ancient transportation system back then. But the remains that we have from the site are mostly two sacrificial pits. and just some foundations of the city structure that we had before. But these two sacrificial pits revealed astonishing quantities of precious stones, ivories, jades, and mostly bronze vessels that we have up here, which would attest to their ability to import and trade such goods with alliance or just neighboring states. This site, when viewed in relation to the Shang dynasty, which is important because in archaeology everything is viewed in relation to each other, but this site, when viewed in relation to the important place that Shang has in Chinese culture and political narrative, we see that it might actually be a predecessor or contemporaneous influencer for the Shang bronze vessels that we know of so well today. The idea that bronze metallurgy developed independently in the Central Plains by the Shang dynasty or its predecessor, the Xia dynasty, is a very much culturally esteemed idea, as we can see from the many bronze vessel museums that we have around China, especially dedicated to this material remain. However, from further archaeological research, we have determined that Sanxingdui's settlement period, so this site here, the settlement period began in the early Xia dynasty and probably even before that, so definitely long before the Shang dynasty. And this diagram here shows that bronze vessel typology or comparisons between bronze vessels with this area and the Shanxi area. So this is from Sanxingdui, and this is from the Central Plains, and they look pretty much the same in terms of motif and vessel shape. So you see that you already have a high level of sophistication in bronze vessels produced at this site before Shang or at the same time as the Shang. And they even might be arguably more sophisticated, as we can see from these bronze masks here that were hollow inside, and these large, I don't have the picture here, but the large kind of like tree-like bronze ritual objects that you also have at Sanxingdui that you do not have in the Shang dynasty. And some scholars even argue that the odd visage of these masks that were pretty much standardized across the masks that you find at this site, they might be from contact with or familiarity with the people of the Near East or other regions that are outside the modern-day Chinese geographical boundaries. So with such similarities, the power of the site is shown in great quantities of their precious goods, and they likely had connections with the Shang already, as they were already a pretty powerful polity by the time the Shang dynasty began. So in this way, the existence and research into this site would be a very important issue when trying to not really debunk, but refute the idea that bronze metallurgy occurred independent or initiated independently in the Shang dynasty in the Central Plains, which is the cradle of Chinese civilization, as we have already heard. However, in order to refute this, it is a rather politically and culturally sensitive issue, and it has yet to be officially recognized. And this is what I hope to look further into. So as we have already seen from only these few archetypal sites, Chinese archaeology is invaluable in its contributions to weaving and reconstructing a Chinese cultural identity, as well as discovering a convoluted past of human history. With archaeological research, the discovery of an overwhelmingly diverse peoples and cultures on this piece of land reveals an inherently heterogeneous foundation for this ostensibly homogeneous nation. As such, we see that archaeology is, like history, often backed with political pretenses that can be a tool used to solidify or exhort ideas about nationalism, even racial purity, as it's often seen as a relatively objective field of study. However, as we can see from the inconclusive ideas about these sites, we now know that a lot of the data remains and needs to be interpreted to become more relevant information. And in these processes of interpretation and excavation, certain subjective elements will play their part in the minds of the archaeologists who are at the site, as well as the people who are writing up these documents later on. This is not to say that archaeology is not objective completely, but the interpretive nature of this field must be acknowledged when we review this published information, and even at the site where you're excavating. So the overlaps between history and archaeology are also grounds to be negotiated and re-examined, as both disciplines to some extent contain inherent biases, and the balance between how we use the data produced from both these sites remain crucial when drawing conclusions about cultures. So I hope that this presentation has successfully relayed some basic information about ancient China and the nuanced archaeological processes that we have used to come to discover it. But more importantly, I hope that some of you seated here today might be more inspired to pursue the field of archaeology, which is often overlooked, to a greater depth, because after all, the discoveries that we have made are more than just pottery and bones, but they're pieces of a collective and complex human history to which archaeology's contribution is indispensable. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Debbie Lee and to Jill Katz for truly informative and educational presentations. I think that we all could agree that Debbie, I think you've managed to put a whole semester's worth of information within half an hour, and it's really very illuminating. But of course, Dr. Katz, we all now know why you're such a popular teacher. We've learned so much from both of these speakers. They both brought to life what the study of ancient history through archaeology has to teach us. And as a student and a teacher of the Bible, who thinks a lot about the ancient world, I think that there's really a different perspective when you look at the realia, and my students in the class on Shir HaShirim, we learn about plants and animals. Of course, it's a love story, so you go out into nature, but you also go to the city and you go to the countryside. And what were you looking at? What did the state look like? What did the temple look like? All of these are things, you kind of read in these ancient texts, but when you see what it actually looked like, that's extremely inspiring. We know that on the Jewish side, and we're learning about it from the Chinese side. And I'm grateful to both of you for giving this dual perspective, which I think is very rich, because you're looking at it not only as a Jewish phenomenon, but it was in other places in the ancient world as well. Let me just conclude by bringing again to your attention our next event. There were some flyers in the back on the Chinese and Jewish ethical codes that come up in the Confucian tradition and compared with Jewish interpretive traditions. This lecture will be given by Professor Roger Ames, who had a distinguished career at the University of Hawaii for 3 decades and is a most influential Confucian scholar, and was invited to Beijing to be a lecturer in Chinese philosophy. And that's a very rare distinction for a foreign professor to be invited to come and teach Chinese about Chinese philosophy. And that's because Professor Ames is successful in taking the ancient texts and showing how they can be relevant for the modern world. And that's extremely exciting, so much so, in fact, that Professor Ames, there are books and articles devoted to his philosophy. And so he's still alive, he's still with us, and he's very vibrant. And so it would be really, I think, very illuminating to come and hear his lecture, which we will compare with Jewish philosophy as well, and Jewish interpretation. And that will be a continuation of our Chinese-Jewish dialogue here at Yeshiva University. And we thank you all for coming out this evening to hear our valuable speakers.